This is week 5, part 3 of our survey of the events from the book of Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy. And in part 3, we're going to continue where we left off in the book of Exodus, and I would refer you to the PDF where the handouts over the 5 books I have in a chart format that will really help as we follow this rather quickly. And as I said in part 2, we're just basically hitting the high points. Back in part 2, we noted how God had dramatically delivered the Israelites from slavery and oppression in Egypt, and we noted that the Exodus event is a picture of what salvation is all about. Yet deliverance from something bad is only half the picture, if you will, of salvation, because salvation also involves entering into a relationship with God and then being delivered to something good. And in this particular section, we're going to note what God ultimately wants this nation to do and to be. And I cite chapter 19 there in verse 6, where there God says, "You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. That was God's directive, of course, to Moses. And Moses, of course, led the people out of Egypt. They find their way down the Sinai Peninsula. If you'll look on a map, and there were a couple of places there where God provided water in a very drought-stricken area, and then he followed that up with the introduction of manna, in a food that would come every morning, except of course on a Sabbath day. All these instances of God's loving care for His people, and now they find themselves back at the base of the mountain where 40 years earlier Moses had encountered God there on the mountain in the burning bush. Well, it wasn't 40 years, but within the last year, Moses had met God there on that mountain, and God had told him then, "You will bring my people back to this point," and He does. And it's there, of course, Moses goes up the mountain, and God then dictates to him what we have come to know as the Ten Commandments. Well, what are the Ten Commandments? And you might say, well, they're laws. And you would be correct. They are in fact laws, but they're more than that. The issue with a law is a law can be circumvented. And laws are in constant need of review and in constant need of being revised and updated. But as I said, laws can also be circumvented, whereas these go beyond that. These are actually principles, absolute principles that cannot be circumvented, that cannot be altered. And to answer the question, the Ten Commandments provide the most basic foundational terms for how Israel should live as the people of God. And so you can follow there in the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, and God presents to His people the what we understand as the Ten Commandments. They're cited twice here in Exodus chapter 20, and then again in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And these become the core elements of this new relationship between God and Israel. These commandments underscore for the nation God's strong emphasis on two things: on relationship and faithfulness, both between God and His people, and also between each other. I want you to notice these first 4 commandments focus on how the people should relate to God. The Lord alone must be worshiped. Don't have any other gods. Don't make or worship idols. Don't misuse the name of the Lord. The old King James says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. The fourth commandment, keep the Sabbath day holy by ceasing work on that day. And as you know, these are principles. These go beyond just the rank and file, do this, don't do that. But these first four deal with our relationship with God. They would be vertical, if you will, man to God. Whereas if you'll note the remaining six, well, this is how we treat each other. Honor your parents. Don't commit murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't give false testimony. Don't covet other people's things. And these are all a part of community. Jesus was asked on a couple of occasions, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus said, love God and love other people. On these two depend all the law and the prophets. Well, he was exactly right, because the first four of these commandments deal with our relationship with God, and then the remaining six deal with our relationships with each other. And God concludes this by saying, I will dwell in your midst. And God is saying, look, I'm not just going to dictate these laws and have them delivered to you and then you're on your own. No, God says, I'm going to be right there in the middle. That is to come down and actually live among his people. And so this will echo throughout all the rest of the Old Testament, how God is relating directly to his people through his presence. And closely associated with this is this requirement or this demand for holiness. God says, I will be your God, you will be my people, and I will dwell in your midst. And that's really an unbelievable responsibility. And this is it's not without accident that for the rest of the book of Exodus and on through the book of Leviticus is this emphasis on holiness. And I would refer you to the PDF with the not only the kind of the chart of Leviticus, but also the outline and all the respective sacrifices and laws. But the basic premise of the book of Leviticus is to instruct the nation on how to live with a holy, awesome God right in their midst. How are you going to do that? How are you going to relate to this God? And so the Ten Commandments serve as a framework. They serve as a framework of the law, and the book of Leviticus adds to that, builds on that. Someone has said it's almost like the Ten Commandments are a skeleton, and then the rest of the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus basically put the body of the law, attach that to the skeleton, and it's all within the context of this concept. Because throughout the book of Leviticus, four times in this book, God will say, "Be holy, because I'm holy." And that's in chapter 11, verse 44, and verse 45, chapter 19, verse 2, chapter 20, and verse 26. Basically, the book of Leviticus is telling this young nation that when the holy God comes to live in your midst, everything in your life is going to change. And so the book of Leviticus then it provides a structure for all of their daily living, categories of things that are clean and unclean, things that are holy, things that are profane, and this was all put in the context of this is how you live. And finally, Leviticus explains to the nation how they can worship God and live with His blessings within this Mosaic covenant. Well, in uh, the rest of it, of course, and here again you can refer to that outline. The sacrificial system again a type and shadow of the great sacrifice of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. And in comparison, the sacrifice of Jesus far surpasses the sacrifice of animals in that regard. Well, in the second half of the book of Leviticus, God makes this covenant with the nation and leads them to construct the tabernacle, and God, of course, then comes to dwell among them. And you could put Exodus and Leviticus about 3 or 4 months apart. Well, the book of Numbers picks up the narrative at this point as God leads Israel onto the promised land, and they are right at the southern entrance into the promised land. And yet here in the book of Numbers, an unbelievable thing happens. The Israelites refuse to enter the land. When they see that it will require faith and hard work in order to conquer that land, they rebel against God and refuse to follow him into the land. And this is unthinkable. And the whole point of that Exodus event was to deliver Israel from Egypt and to deliver them to this promised land. Now they've left Egypt, but now they're refusing to enter into the promised land. And so they reject the land. They reject the idea of conquering it. And when God hears their ridiculous reasons for not entering the land, he sends them all back into the wilderness, where they will wander aimlessly for 40 years until that faithless generation dies off. That's what they had requested. And yet God still watches over the nation, and even as they wander in the wilderness, eventually this disobedient generation will die off and a new generation arises. God then leads this generation back toward the promised land, but they have to understand clearly how they must live in that relationship with him. And so right before they go into the land, he presents them with Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy means second law. Well, there really wasn't a second law. It was the law that was repeated for a second time. And there are a lot of similarities between the between Exodus and Leviticus, and then of course the book of Deuteronomy. As I said, it means second law, but it means that it's being repeated again. And there are a lot of things in the book of Deuteronomy that we don't see in Leviticus, and vice versa. But these people are given the law again, and the book of Deuteronomy defines the terms by which Israel can live in this new land, just like their predecessors had received during the giving of the law the first time. And as I said, it literally means second law. It's the second presentation of what's found from Exodus 16 through Leviticus. And the challenge of this, of course, is to remain faithful to God. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. That became a verse that the Jewish people would recite every morning. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And of course, in the New Testament, Jesus would add in with all your mind in that regard. So remain faithful to God. Avoid idolatry. This new generation could not commit the same sin that their parents and grandparents had. Avoid that idolatry. Do not follow other gods. Deuteronomy 6:14 through 15. And then practice justice. And we're going to see in the next, in part 4 of this, that they were given these directives. And this generation, of course, are willing to do that. But the next generation for whatever reason, fails to do that. And this is the reason behind that. For the Lord your God is a God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. The book of Numbers follows the basic structure of other ancient law codes, like the Hittite suzerainty treaty, the Code of Hammurabi, and others. And while the fulfillment of the Abraham covenant still hovers in the background, it's Deuteronomy that now takes center stage as the dominant background for the balance of this narrative.